from this chapter 4 of Dr. Françoise O'Kane's book, Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self. And there's a fun little passage here called, who's joined us here just before? Oh, hi, Jerome, I'm glad you're here. I'm about to read from page 70 of Dr. O'Kane's book in a subtitle called Lucifer on Earth. And so I thought that might be a good way to get the discussion going and maybe have some of our YouTube followers join in. Just need to set up my screen a little better. Okay. All right, there we go. So it's okay. All right, so this is called Lucifer on Earth. Now, this is a rant that somebody started to blow into a airliner. This is what he said. Quote, "I shall get you, Lucifer. I shall triumph over your nefarious powers. You think that you may do as you please. You have destroyed my world everywhere, always, my cosmos, and you are now settling in people's hearts, making them as heavy as stones. The planets, my galaxies. You have even invaded my black holes. You have taken everything over. The sun has spots. The world is rotten. It has been eaten away from the roots. Everything stinks. No one can breathe. The children have damn all to laugh about. The lakes are radioactive. Everything is barren. Man is not alive any longer. Look at your children's despair, but you don't believe for one moment that you have won. I shall fight you. I shall conquer the cosmos back from you. Sin and evil have invaded everything. Man has lost hope. People have sacrificed to the golden calf. Look at them, look at their eyes, but I shall not let you get away with it. I shall fight you to the bitter end. I shall take my planet back," unquote. Then she goes on. During the whole time of the above tirade, of which this is only a fragment, the man delivering it kept his head turned toward the sun. He was shouting, his eyes wide open, standing at the front of a bus in the center of a city, wearing a Napoleon field hat. A heavy silence had invaded the bus. The passengers listened with thoughtful looks on their faces. One man got angry and mumbled something about useless people. But as our crusader was getting out, an old lady turned to me and said, "You know, it is sad, but he is right." I quote this cosmic delirium because of its expressiveness. Is there a better image of the fight between life and death, or of the advent of the reign of the Antichrist, to which Jung alluded? Of course, one may object that this man was a visionary, a madman, an extreme case. I'm not sure whether he really identified with God, or whether, on the contrary, he was going to fight alone and conquer the cosmos. The attitude of the crusader, one who is determined to vanquish evil at all costs, is grounded in the hero archetype, and more particularly in the concretization as the pure, fearless knight. The negative pole of the hero archetype is imaged in the rebel. Patrick, an Analysand, is one of these rebels, a dark hero who often invests as much energy in destruction as the visionary does in attempting to rescue the world. The rebel's mode is sinister, aggressive, desperate, but from the point of view of the amount of libido invested, he is a mirror image of his gallant brother. I'll stop it there. Any comments there?
Hey, Skip, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my internet's been going on and off all day, so I don't know if it'll top down or up, whatever. Anyway, I like the visionary idea because I'm a visionary, and when I get something on my mind, it just goes like crazy until I have to finish it. So I
Yeah.
can identify with that drive that happens when you try to make your vision come true or something, you know.
Yes. Miles.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, at some point, I believe you read how Jung really said, let's stop and listen to the schizophrenics because maybe they have something we should hear, or words to that effect. And so this man ranting on the bus is perhaps a schizophrenic, but
Well, maybe
you know, something coming through.
Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not.
You know, this woman is a Jungian analyst. She's not a psychiatrist. And so schizophrenics, I think, usually go to psychiatrists, not psychologists. It's just people with neurosis that go to psychologists, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jerome. Maybe you know more than I do on this.
Well, I would think if it is diagnosed as a schizophrenia, it probably is through a what you'd call an MD type of a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the treatment and the different facilities can be run by any, you know, as far as the maintenance throughout.
Sure. But the prescription has to come from a psychiatrist, which is an MD.
Yeah.
And well, so I sort of relate to this in a couple of ways. In one way, I was doing this lawsuit for the last 9 years, and I really, in some ways, felt this way because, you know, I found all kinds of skullduggery in the Maryland court system and in the judiciary, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and I found how the financial industry of the United States has basically gotten themselves paid double on all defaulted mortgages after 2008, because they got paid once by the TARP, and then they didn't pass the largesse on to the average person. And so they got paid a second time when they are foreclosed on people's homes, even though they had already had their risk ameliorated. And, you know, you see it right outside in my community, which has a marina attached to it. And we have all kinds of really heavy fiberglass out there. I mean, boats that are up to 100 feet long. And, you know, we didn't used to see boats that big on the Chesapeake. And so there are people that just have more money than Cretius. And does it make them happy? I don't think so. But anyway. And so.
Yeah, I just read Steve Jobs wrote a letter, you know, right before he was about to die. And he said the same thing. He said, I was driving for money and I thought that was the answer. And he said, I found out right at the end, of course, that it was really about loving and family and things like that made meaning in his life. But he got caught up in it and it just became like a addiction.
Yes.
Getting the money.
So. Absolutely. And so when I was, you know, digging at the bones of the legal system, you know, I was told by one significant administrator in the legal system, I won't say who, that, all these laws are just, how did he put it? Aspirational. And so, you know, we're never going to let you through in your lawsuit. We're never going to let you get to a trier of fact, because then we might lose. Okay, a trier of fact means a jury. So they never allowed me to go take my case to be heard before a jury, because if they had done, it would have exposed all their skullduggery. And so from their point of view, the laws are just aspirational. But, you know, I didn't practice for 40 years, but I've been an attorney for 44 years now. and yeah, I guess it was about 4 years ago that I first heard that, maybe a little earlier. And I was just flabbergasted that was the attitude, that they just wouldn't hear a case, even though the laws of Maryland, the laws of the United States, the judicial rules of conduct were all violated very heavily, and all clearly demonstrated in my papers. And yet, you know, those papers have now, of course, been sealed so that nobody can find them.
Well, I would certainly be very upset and angry and about to jump out of my skin if I found that to be the case.
Well, I've
realized something like that happens. What you think is real is you find out what's real, and that kind of makes you wonder, you know.
Yeah, they could never let me through, because if they let me through, then everybody in the country would open up a foreclosure fight, and
class action suit.
No, it doesn't work that way, because they changed the law, so now you can't sue the banking industry on a class action.
Oh, okay. People use Roundup though can. People use Roundup can do that, right?
People who use Roundups? I'm sorry, I'm not quite following your point, Jerome.
Oh, the Roundup spray that you use to kill weeds.
Yeah.
The people are always saying if you get certain type of cancer, call them and you can get millions of dollars or something.
Yeah, which isn't true, but
yeah.
Actually, somebody was awarded $2 billion with a B in California. It's a crazy amount. Yeah.
Yeah. The question is, did they ever collect it? Getting it awarded from the jury and then ever actually collecting it is two different things. But anyway, so I've been doing these readings from Dr. O'Kane's book. And plus we had the interview with Paul VanderKlay. And so I thought I would give our watchers an opportunity to ask questions or discuss any point that they wanted to. I mean, is a certain amount of angst on the Gethsemane reading, because I don't know if you saw that, but the Gethsemane reading it basically says that when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ had to accept that there was a dark side of God, and he did accept it, and he at one point thought about copping out from going up on the cross by just committing suicide. Apparently, in the passage, I'm not a great biblical scholar, but anyway, the point was that Christ prayed 3 times. Do I really have to go ahead and let them crucify me? And since he didn't get any help from the Almighty, he took it that he had to, and he did, which was his self, his father, telling him he had to do it in order to fulfill his mission on earth. And as I've gone through all of these, and so I've had a lot of pushback by various people about, well, geez, I don't really get how God can be bad. And of course, the whole point of the way Christianity has been taught for 2,000 years is that God is all good, all the evil is in Satan. And so when Dr. Jung and I start to say things like, well, Satan is part of God too, then people haven't been taught that way, and so they definitely push back, and understandably.
Yeah, I was thinking about that today, and it seems to be like anything that we might be afraid of, we push back, like you said. But it was the way they set it up, it was a denial of evil. So when you deny something and push it back, what's your reaction going to be to that? And that's going to be fear.
Right.
And you don't want to approach that. And then I guess what what we're talking about is there's a certain point in your development where you need to face some of the fears, and you really have to decide whether you want to do that or not.
Right. And the consequence of not facing it was the 20th century, basically 175 million deaths, because the traditions of Christianity as it had been taught up to 1500, that all worked very well until the scientific method came along. And then all of a sudden, all these myths aren't true for various reasons, because the scientific method says, well, that's not true. Well, that's not true. Well, that's not true. Then what are we talking about these stories then? Why are these stories important? And so I think even Paul was having a hard time understanding why you can't just tell the story in the context of ancient people and have it connect to people in the present day. I think that's the issue. Thoughts? No? Okay.
I thought Miles would have a thought. I was waiting for him. I guess not. Anyway, yeah, I see what you're saying in terms of that. When you push that down, you're denying it, and it goes deeper into the unconscious.
Right, and it builds up energy.
Yeah, and whatever you resist, it builds and it will come erupting out, just like the anger would come out. You erupts out. The problem with what we've had in the wars is it becomes a virus and it spreads, and it's kind of like, I hate to say it, but there's a lot of that going on today in terms of...
Well, there's a psychic epidemic that gets going.
Yes. And if it gets too far, then people do crazy things to each other. And we've lost that connection with either common sense or just what happened to the love in the world that we first came into,
Right, exactly. And, it's obvious that this has been what the administration has been trying to whip up for a couple of years now, is trying to whip up this white supremacy stuff in the hope that it would catch on as it did in the 1920s in Germany. And what I don't think he quite understood or understands, and his henchmen, is that we're not Weimar Germany. Okay, in other words, in Germany, if a psychic epidemic got going, pretty much everybody would be swept up in it, and that's what happened. But in this country, we have so much diversity in the country that people push back immediately. And the same would be true in Canada, right, Miles? You've got enough diversity to defend yourself against wacko ideas.
Yes. And one of the things that we really need to remember is that skin color has absolutely nothing to do with the circumstances we find ourselves in. And what I mean by that is, I appreciate that, for example, the indigenous people will say, it's white supremacy has done this to us. And I'm not going to argue with them, that the First Nations have been terribly treated, and we're missing a great opportunity to learn from their wisdom. But when some of them do start calling it white supremacy, it's really unfortunate, because you are not actually focused on what is the issue, right? It's beliefs. It has nothing to do with skin color. My beliefs have nothing to do with my skin color. And when you start to address issues like you did with respect to TARP and the banking industry and what happened in 2008, you might have heard, you can tell me if you did, well, Skip, you're a conspiracy theorist.
Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist because I put the whole case on the record.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is people will toss this out if you question anything. And I'm now of the point of making sure that I'll counter people who say, well, Miles, I don't believe, I haven't gotten into these conspiracy theories that you're talking about. And I'll say now, no, all I'm talking about are anomalies. There are anomalies that we need to investigate. And if we started adding up all the anomalies, they never end. Like Jeffrey Epstein, how does he commit suicide in these circumstances? And how is it that all these things come together at once? You've got guards falling asleep. You've got cameras failing. You've got him being taken off of a suicide watch, when any psychologist apparently would say that's crazy. And there'd be a long list of these anomalies. That's all I'm wanting, to have a proper investigation into anomalies. So anyway, I think that's important.
Yeah, I'm not believing it was a suicide personally.
Well, it's very hard to accept it if it's not thoroughly investigated.
I can't accept it because he could have committed suicide anytime. I mean, okay, so what? He gets sentenced to 45 years in prison. Well, he can commit suicide then, right? He doesn't have to commit suicide before the trial comes up. The reason he committed suicide now was they didn't want the trial to come up.
I'd just also add that when it comes to the Bible, for a long time now, and I've shared some of my personal experiences with the Roman Catholic Church versus the Eastern Orthodox Church, and these are again anomalies that I'm saying, hey, when I read the Bible, it tells me not to add one iota to the Bible. And yet, when I think about it, what I see and I witness, there's all sorts of anomalies where stuff's added to the Bible.
Okay, so let me just observe a couple of comments here from our viewers from YouTube. Hello, Brandy, and welcome. We're glad that you could join us tonight. And Anthony says, Occam's razor with Epstein. Yeah, exactly. Now, one thing you may wonder why I brought these issues up tonight, and I realized that back in March I put out a poll about what people wanted to talk about on this YouTube channel, and it turns out that 53% responded that they wanted to hear about political psychology and psychological issues as they relate to politics. And that was by far the most. I mean, there was, 10 or 15% that likes the readings and 10 or 15% who like this or that. But but 53%, which really surprised me. I hadn't looked back at the results because I just forgot that I had done this poll, and lo and behold, that was the result. And so,
how much had Jung done on that particular analyzing psychology? I think he got in trouble.
well, he stayed away from them, and and that's one of my criticisms of him, because he knew what was coming. I mean, he could see what was coming in Germany, and he didn't speak up about it. I mean, I don't hold him, I don't think he was an anti-Semite, and I don't think he was a conspirator for the Nazis per se, but he also didn't say anything about what was going on, really. I mean, he wrote one rather arcane article called Wotan in 1936, which basically was a sub-rosa message to his colleagues in Germany to watch out. You're having a psychic epidemic going.
So he did warn them, in other words.
Yeah, he did warn the psychiatric and psychological community in Germany. His colleagues who, when Hitler came to power, he was the president of the German Psychological Association. And then Hitler got Goering, I think it's Goering's brother or cousin, as the head of the Psychological Association of Germany, and pushed Jung aside. But they still used his name, and Jung was very worried about it. So he wrote this article, which would obviously have meant something to the psychologist, but it didn't mean anything to anybody else, because you'd have to know Jungian psychology in order to understand that this was a warning to the professionals in the country. And when he did it in 1936, it was probably way too late by then, way too late, because as we know historically, Hitler was elected. When he was elected chancellor, he was elected by the most votes ever of a German chancellor until Angela Merkel, which 70 or 80 years later, Angela Merkel got more votes, but until she came on the scene and became chancellor in 2006, all those years, that's 70 years plus, Hitler had the most popularity from 1934 on. So it's very dangerous. And I don't think we're out of the woods yet, personally, in terms of what can happen in the United States if the wrong things happen. It just depends. I mean, obviously, we all saw what happened in 9/11. I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, all the flags flew off the shelves, and every other car driving down the highway had American flags flying, and all this patriotism came up spontaneously. That's all well and good. There's nothing wrong with the patriotism and pulling together if you're being attacked. But you can see how fast it comes up out of the unconscious. What was happening in Calgary, Miles, at that time? Were people reacting?
Well, yeah, we were shocked. I remember driving to work. At that time, I was working for the railway and doing training. And when I got to the training center that morning, we actually were able to turn on a television. Wasn't the greatest picture because we didn't have cable. We were just relying on rabbit ears in those days in that particular room. But it was shocking to see these buildings collapsing. And, at that time, they, now talk about anomalies, there's a long list of anomalies that haven't been totally investigated. And in fact, there's a lawyers committee for 9/11 Truth is actually pushing for a grand jury at this present time. It's a fascinating effort by lawyers teaming up with engineers and architects and firemen to investigate these anomalies.
Mm-hmm.
I just say that at that time, they did eventually ground all the air transport. It's very strange, though, again, talk about anomalies, that your United States air defenses were all tied up in exercises in different parts of North America. In fact, up in northern Canada and Alaska, they had a lot of the interceptor jets, and there was a woefully inadequate response. And in fact, the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who you interviewed, you can find him on shortly after 9/11. He's interviewed, and he, as a former Minister of Defense, is saying, where were the interceptor jets?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an anomaly that it hasn't totally been explained. But anyway, they did ground all of the air transport over North America, or over the United States. I don't think Canadian airspace was still open, but there were numerous flights had to come in and land. They were destined for the United States, and they landed at airports in Canada, and particularly in Gander, Newfoundland, where there's a military base, Canadian military base.
Right.
And they absorbed several dozen big jumbo jets and such. And
right. But
anyway,
after the event, did anything manifest among the populace of Canada that you can recall?
Yes, there was a massive rally, as I recall, on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, in sympathy and in grieving with the United States. And we joined very quickly the fight, or taking the fight into Afghanistan. We joined in on that response to get Osama bin Laden. But one of the things that we didn't do was we refused to attack Iraq when the United States decided that they felt it was necessary to go to Iraq, which they now actually realize really wasn't.
Wasn't what they said it was. Right.
Exactly.
But I'm talking about actual citizens. I'm talking about something like in the United States, we saw the manifestation of individual citizens doing things, on the highways, riding down the highway with flags flying out of their cars. We still see that occasionally, but
in Canada, other than, as I said, on Parliament Hill and probably in front of consular offices, I would imagine, I wouldn't be surprised there would have been people gathering in solidarity. But, I think Canada always is a little more, always has been more reserved in flag waving or, sort of exuberance and patriotic feelings. I think we're just a little more reserved. Plus, I think, we do, from this side of the border, often, wonder, well, why is the United States doing some of the things that it does? So we don't just automatically, I guess, get very emotional. It was emotional to see the buildings collapse.
In fairness, Canada was not attacked. So Craig says, Craig Nelson says, Hillman says European identifying as white, not as Germans, French, Scottish, English, etc., started with Christians in Massachusetts in the 1600s and is inherently racist, a very dangerous projection. I think that's probably true, and it's in the puritanical strain of the American psyche is certainly that. I mean, until recent years, I never heard of people, I never heard of most Americans identifying themselves by their ethnic origins. And indeed, most Americans can't, okay, because mine, just in my grandparents, are Dutch, Swedish, Welsh, and German. And so we're all 57 varieties one way or another. Craig, I sent you an email. You can join this conversation if you like also. So if there's anyone who's watching on YouTube who would like to join the panel and join the discussion, we'd welcome you to join us. If you haven't received, I sent an email to a bunch of folks who we know who are involved in our activities one way or another. And so far, Miles and Jerome are the two that have come for tonight, but we've had many others in other times. But if anyone who's watching is interested, you can send an email to skip.conover@gmail.com and say that you're interested in being part of the panel, and then we will give you the Zoom access so that you can participate in the panel. I'm using Zoom to get through to YouTube these days because I was having so much trouble with OBS being unreliable. And so...
Well, it works very well, but I would invite people to join the party because we're up here and we would like to have some more people to compare notes with, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've had some very, very smart discussion comments on some of my recent readings. And so I know that there are viewers out there that have information that would be useful to share. And one of the thing I'd like to mention is that if you haven't subscribed to this channel, I urge you to do so. Amazingly, I get statistics every day, and it's very surprising that about, I would say, 60% of the people that come and view videos here have not subscribed to the channel. And so I think it would be terrific if people would subscribe to the channel and we could get that number over 50%, because a lot of people are just coming to the channel out of, they're just randomly hitting on it, I guess, when they're looking for something else. And
well, I think YouTube gives recommendations if you're watching something similar. And so I've seen it popped up all the time on different things.
Right. I'm sure that's true. So shall we talk about some of these other issues that, did either of you want to comment on the VanderKlay interview for public consumption?
Well, I will. I had some comments written down.
Okay, terrific.
You won't like, should I start with the good news or the bad news?
Start with the bad news.
People were really upset when you said Bible is a doorstop. There were a lot of comments.
A lot of comments when I said the Bible was a doorstop.
Yeah,
that was intentional, Jerome.
Well, I know that, but I mean,
right.
And that was the people kind of didn't know what you meant, I suppose, and I think you explained it quite well when you gave the response.
Yeah.
You talked about the Alcoholic Anonymous being similar to Jung.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one about evil where he said suffering and, I can't say this word, malevolence.
Malevolence?
Malevolence, yeah.
Malevolence.
Versus beauty and love. And the transposition of that. And I think that's probably a topic that relates. I don't know how you would relate that.
You're talking about as opposites?
Versus, yeah.
Well, one of the things we were talking about, which I really strongly have an allergy to, and so therefore I'm on the other side of the coin from Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, almost every talk I hear him give lately says, the world is suffering tinged with malevolence. And I say, well, that's really Eeyore's point of view, I guess. I mean, from Winnie the Pooh, remember Eeyore, the donkey who's always sad. But, okay, so every religion is trying to address suffering. I agree with that. And every religion is talking about holding off chaos. So they're trying to provide order to chaos, right? And, that's well and good, but, religions are also about other things, happy things, weddings, christenings, all kinds of things that are not about malevolence, and they're not about the awful sides of life. I mean, if the world was really only suffering tinged by malevolence, I think we would have all run off the cliff with Abraham some time ago. But that's not the way it is. We human beings like our lives in general. I mean, who wants to die?
Yeah, I don't know if they're confusing what Peterson is saying with, Peterson says we're in chaos and we have to suffer our way through all this. And I mean, it kind of becomes a problem in that what we're saying with Eros and God is in the chaos, and logic and order is with order. And then we say that because we're too logocentric, we're throwing the world into chaos. So it's kind of a
the problem for Christianity has been that, okay, all the logic that came up from Augustine on and earlier writers, the participants of the Council of Nicaea and all those people came up with very rational ways of talking about religion and chaos, and dealing with the sacred, with the chaos. And the problem is that around 1500, with Galileo and a few other people, we started to see that some things that the church was saying weren't true. They weren't true. And so by the end of the 19th century, Nietzsche was only reporting what was in everybody's mind, which is, there's no truth in these myths. And the problem is that's not true. Okay. The problem is the myths tell the story of the human condition, and they tell it in terms of what happens to every one of us every day. I mean, in one way or another, we're all faced with the issues that came up for the ancients. But by talking about it in terms of these ancient people, then the pastor doesn't have to say, well, this is Jack and Susie here in the church that are having this problem, and this is how they need to deal with it. Instead, he can talk about an event that happened 2,000 years ago, and then Jack and Susie get the idea. But the problem is has gotten so attenuated through the church pushing through the dogma, which isn't true, and it got all the rationalists to get off the boat, get off the bus.
Well, I think the dogma was true at one time, but it's ran out of its meaning.
Well, it was true enough, certainly.
And lost its meaning, and what we're trying to do, and what you're saying with Jung, is we're trying to see if we can figure out a way to recover that meaning, make it meaningful.
Yeah.
But what happened with all the logos is the religious groups started dividing and splitting, and it just broke them apart. And now they're scattered in pieces all over the place.
Right.
And you got each faction protecting each one. I'm not saying that's bad. It's because each group performs a valuable service to, as you say, do weddings and the joys of life and Christianity, all the stuff that comes with that.
Right.
What we've done is, by doing that, is created chaos.
Well, we've created chaos. That's right.
From too much order, and then it broke down.
Right. And so the stories, the narratives per se, are true. Okay. In other words, I was saying at the end of my reading about Gethsemane the other day that, man, that happened to me. It actually happened to me because I'm facing myself telling me to join the Marine Corps, right? In the middle of the Vietnam War, at the height of the Vietnam War, March 1967, my self is telling me to join the Marines. And yet most of my counterparts in my generation, certainly in my school, I went to a school that only had 180 in my class, and of that 180, only 16 served at all. Only 16 were either drafted or served. And so everyone else had to dodge to get out. And so, and I'm not saying they weren't courageous in their own way. They had the same decision the other way, because their self is saying, whoa here, Buster, if you go to Vietnam, you might end up dead. You shouldn't do that. You should have the courage to stand up to fight the government about pursuing this war. And so they had that courage, and they were willing to give up their nationality. I know many people who went to Canada. I know one man who deserted from the Navy and went to Canada. He had been a corpsman in the Marine. He was a Navy corpsman, but the problem with being a Navy corpsman, which is a medical assistant, basically a first aid guy, is that you're in the Marine Corps. You're not in the Navy, because they were bringing in corpsmen and then they were putting them with infantry battalions. And so there were these Navy guys who were actually serving with the Marines, and that was not what they thought they were signing up for. They thought they were going to be dispensing drugs on ships instead of being out with a rifle platoon out in the rice paddies, which is what happened to a lot of those guys. And so one of my friends deserted, went to Canada, went to McGill University during that time, and he was able to come back and become a lawyer because of the amnesty. Became a U.S. lawyer in Virginia because there was amnesty, and and to this day I'm conflicted about that, but I understand from the point of view of 2020 hindsight that we had to get past that. So we had to grant amnesty in order to leave that time behind. If we hadn't, we would have torn the country apart, probably, because so many people had left the country. And I just don't know what would have happened. I do have one friend who left the country and stayed out. He still has a U.S. passport, but he lives in northern British Columbia. And so anyway.
Yeah, we had the same thing. We had people that would go to Canada, and it was just back then and there, it was people were doing what you said, dodging. We had people doing all sorts of things. But what you're saying is that the courage to face the fear, which is what
whatever we had to face, whatever our self told us to do.
Yeah.
Right. Either side, whichever side.
Right.
Okay. The fellow in northern British Columbia is still my best friend in life. And I can't argue with the position he took because he was right. Okay. Because the Vietnam War was wrong. And I knew it was wrong too when I signed up. In other words, in 1967, when I signed up, I had already known for 5 years that it was a mistake. And that was because in 1962, my father took me out on the dock in Yokosuka and showed me a line of gray hulls going out Tokyo Bay from Yokosuka, which is the headquarters of the 7th Fleet. And he said, see that? That's the Marines. They're going to Vietnam. Everybody in the military has either been to Vietnam, is there now, or is going there. And whoa, okay. So why, Dad? And he said, because the generals need a war to run their careers. And pretty definitely we see America getting into a pretty major conflict every decade or so.
I'm not sure, but I believe Canada must have recognized that the war was wrong, the Vietnam War was wrong, because it allowed Americans to just come in like refugees and conscientious objectors. And so in law, they must have been recognized by Canada as having a legitimate argument to that the war was wrong. One of the things,
I think they were playing both sides because they were also sending Canadians to Vietnam. I mean, I served with some Canadians at
right. Yeah, it's always very complex, and there's not always it's not ever clear cut, black and white.
Right.
One of the things I would like to bring in is the very fact that your current reading is called Sacred Chaos.
Right.
And the diametric to that is profane order, profane logos. Right. And what I think we need to really
address
that was like boom, like, wow, that's fascinating. Sacred chaos. But indeed, if we don't appreciate that there's a sacredness to chaos, and sacred meaning perhaps that it needs to be appreciated.
Right.
Because indeed, essentially the United States lost the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And that's an example of profane order. Your U.S. military is an example of extreme order, yet it was these guerrilla warfare in the rice paddies, in the jungles, that actually defeated the mighty U.S. military over there. And the same thing in the hills of Afghanistan.
Well, the point that Dr. O'Kane is making, and I admit that until 2 weeks ago, I had not thought of it in this way either, but it makes a lot of sense, and especially when you think in terms of people who are having mental health issues, and neurotic problems, and is that the way it's being explained now, and which I'm now accepting, is that what is sacred is irrational. Okay, what if you? I mean, I live on the shore of the Severn River, at the mouth of the Severn, so we can look across to the eastern shore of Maryland and to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge from where I live. And it's quite beautiful. And, you know, we see all these things happening among the birds all the time. And then the last few days, all of a sudden, we see how utterly polluted the Chesapeake Bay has become. And so it's very obvious that some upstream industry has dumped a lot of stuff probably into the Susquehanna River or into the bay itself. I don't know which. But it hasn't been that way in the past, but this administration is basically cutting up the EPA. And, you know, I remember, and Jerome probably remembers, how we used to have advertising on black and white TV back when we were kids, where they would have advertisements against pollution. Okay, against pollution, like, you know, they'd say, you know, polluted, then polluted again. And I remember going to California, driving to California in 1949 or 50 maybe, in California, and the ditches along the sides of the roads at that time were just filled with trash. Okay, people were just throwing stuff out of their cars all the way along the highway. And one time my father had a little pup tent, and we were little kids, so he wanted to just camp beside the side of the road. And I remember having to basically wade through all the garbage that was on the sides of the roads. And so there was a big campaign at that time to you know, clean it up and stop all the litter. And so we did. And so we mostly don't see that litter along the sides of the roads anymore, or in most places in the United States today. You know, we have some people that scoff that, but the profane is anything that Logos has provided. Okay. You know, if you're standing on the shore of the Severn, you know, the dock into the Severn is a profanity, because it changes the natural scene. And then if you turn around and look at my community, which has like 300 condos in it, and it has a marina with many big pieces of fiberglass in it. That's pretty profane. Okay, that's you know, taking a piece out of the beauty and perfection of nature, and the beauty and perfection of God's plan. Okay, and Dr. Jung, go ahead, Jerome.
Well, you could also make the other argument. I think there was a comment on VanderKlay's about someone that said that God is in the Logos and Eros. They're both sides of the coin.
Well, right.
And so if you think about, it could be a sacred Logos and a sacred Eros. It's just for the points that we're trying to make here, because, you know, the Logos is what we build and we dream and we make that happen. And
sure.
Some people see that as beautiful, you know.
Right, and so we have something like Notre Dame.
Right. In other words, yeah, that's a Logos that was built, and
right.
It was
and quite beautiful. And,
right, but it also had Eros involved with it in terms of if you look at the structure, and it was all there's a lot of mandalas Mandalist or Mandal. I don't know how you say that word.
Mandalist.
Excuse my pronunciation. But.
I don't know what the correct pronunciation is either. I pronounced it all those ways in the past, but you know the what I learned. Okay, I learned a couple of things that week that Notre Dame burned. Okay, I came into the house while it was burning and turned on my television and saw it in flames, and I immediately started to sob. And that night I ran a session of this group, and the first 10 minutes of that session, I only showed pictures of it burning, and I was sobbing during that early part of that session, which a lot of people commented on. And so I'm saying to myself now, what is it that I'm sobbing about? Because I'm not Catholic. And so I reflected on that. And a week later, I realized that none of my feelings about Notre Dame had changed one bit after the burning of Notre Dame. And in fact, you know, God works in mysterious ways. The fathers of the church couldn't get the French government to put up $1 million to keep renovating Notre Dame, to keep it going. And yet, as soon as the fire happened, they got $1 billion promised by the French government instantly. And so that's 1,000 times more than they were asking for the previous week. And so,
yeah, once you see that and visit that, it's a spiritual experience. It was for me. So
right. Well, it is a spiritual experience.
Don't forget that. I was in awe and wonder and was going, how could they do this? You know?
Yeah. But I mean, I was saying to myself a week later that, you know, it wasn't the loss of the artifacts that bothered me at all. I mean, I thought it was, you know, the reason I was sobbing was I thought it was that. And in actuality, nothing about my feelings about Notre Dame have changed one bit from before, not a bit. And so it's that's sacred. Okay, it's that feeling about what Notre Dame represents that's sacred, truly sacred.
Yeah, and you cannot deny that experience.
You cannot deny that, and
that's what we're talking about. Let's have some experience instead of just talking logos about how to do this, that, and some of your arguments with. I enjoyed some of the arguments you had on VanderKlay in terms of, I said, Skip is really a good lawyer. You had a very lengthy discussion. You got the guy down to the truth, you know, and he said, thank you. So anyway, it was, I enjoyed that. That was fun.
I got VanderKlay down to the truth. Is that what you're saying? Or?
No, you were having a discussion with someone on the chat.
Oh, okay.
Well, you know,
I don't know if you got VanderKlay down. Anyway.
Well, I think I got through to him, but anyway, go ahead.
About the Bible as being a doorstop. It can actually be. It can be taken. The Bible can be taken and abused, you know, and it can be abused not only by someone literally using it as a doorstop or even a footstool to stand on to get to the higher shelf, but as I said to somebody who took exception to that, I said, well, you know, Jesus, as Jerome just brought to the table, you know, he was the sacred logos. So yeah, there's sacred logos and there's profane logos. And I think we are challenged with always needing to question, well, are we the doers of the profane logos? Are we abusing the sacred logos. And, I said that, some of this very rigid fundamentalist attitude of, only those who profess Jesus Christ are going to be saved. I think people who have that attitude may be very sadly mistaken. These people who I would say wave the Bible around, and the ones that have actually condemned people, other people's beliefs. I don't think Jesus would ever do that. From my knowledge,
wouldn't support it in any way.
No, he wouldn't support it in any way. And the profane logos. One of the things I'd like to mention is again what we create. Like you mentioned, plastic. Mm-hmm. We've gone in with chemistry and we've made these molecules that take 400 years to decompose.
Right.
So we're responsible for creating some profane logos in the plastic that's fouling your Chesapeake Bay. We are responsible for creating these nuclear power plants where a nuclear engineer down there, Arnie Gunderson, Fairwinds Energy Education, he says that inside a nuclear reactor, the size of this small room that I'm sitting in, the reactor has 4 million horsepower.
Wow.
And that's profane logos to keep that thing bottled up. And every once in a while we lose it, right? And then you've got profane chaos spread all over the countryside.
Did you see the special series called Chernobyl?
No, I haven't. I don't have HBO, but someday I hope to be able to see it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's visible on other channels. So Brandy says here on the chat, there is a video out on YouTube called I Pet Goat 2. It's very symbolic. The video is a masterpiece. You really believe you should take a look at it. So Brandy, if possible, could you put a link to that video while we're talking here? That would be very helpful, and I'll certainly approve the link. Sometimes when you put a link on the chat, YouTube will stop it, but I think we can all allow it. Well, let me, since we're talking about this issue of sacred versus logos, I want to read where that came from O'Kane's point of view, which is one page here. And she's referring to an essay by Rudolf Otto. And the essay is called The Idea of the Holy, an Inquiry into the Non-Rational Factor in the Idea of the Divine and its Relation to the Rational. Okay, so this is what she says. According to Rudolf Otto's essay on the divine, man always has an ambivalent attitude toward transcendent aspects of life, since the powers involved are both benevolent and nefarious on the one hand, and not easily controlled on the other. The sacred is fundamentally given, both changing and immovable, and it remains unquestionable and unfathomable. It precedes humanity and contains us. It is only when societies elaborate a religious system and confront the transcendence of the sacred that it starts losing some of its ambivalent nature. Religions, and here comes the logos, religions, by postulating an order, provide us with a basis from which to attempt to cope with the unfathomable. They establish causes and relationships with respect to which prescribed gestures or practices are believed to provoke certain consequences. The parallels with what happens at a psychic level in the relationship between the ego and the self are obvious. Okay, let me read that again because my eyes blinked out on me. The parallels with what happens at the psychic level in the relationship between the ego and the self are obvious. The self is given and unquestionable and unfathomable. It manifests an ambiguous nature, both benevolent and nefarious. Further, far from being only an ordering principle, the self, like the sacred, is related to chaos. It pertains to nature and to the origins of humanity. It is a powerful entity which thinking and reason cannot simply structure and explain. The contrast between profane and sacred may also be seen as a contrast between order and chaos, but this does not necessarily imply a separation of order from chaos. Profane order remains part of a greater sacred whole. It is a modified form of chaos, and the uncontrollable, unstructured sacred may at any time invade daily life and upset the control exerted by individuals. In a similar way, the ego is contained and related to the self as a transcendent entity that may interfere with the control exerted by the ego. However, by discovering an adequate way of relating to the self, the ego may find a way of coping and remaining in touch with a dimension that gives the psyche a place within the chaos. Van Gennep writes that the sacred periodically pivots on its own axis. That is, whenever everyday structures are being changed, whenever a passage to another life stage needs to take place, one comes face to face with chaos. The sacred may invade the profane at any time. Any individual may be thrown back into a primeval chaotic state which both contrasts with everyday life and transcends it, thus also broadening it. Psychologically speaking, this phase must be seen as an opportunity for the ego to find a better grounding and to relate differently to the dark aspects in the unconscious. Now, I can certainly relate to this because as I was going through my early life, it never occurred to me that I might divorce my first wife, okay? But we came to a time of one of these changes in the stages of life, and then all of a sudden, a power greater than I was basically ended my first marriage and sent me on to my second marriage, which has turned out quite well. But I'm still very close to my first wife. And I'm sort of surprised that I am not celebrating my 50th wedding anniversary or 51st wedding anniversary this year, as opposed to I was with my first wife for 17 years, and I've been with my second now for, I guess, 34 years. So I've been married for 50 years, but with two different women. And so I know that this power that says it's over, move on, is very powerful, and from my own experience. Brandy says the video was created by Heliofont. You can look it up under Heliofont. It's the only video he has created. Okay, great. And John Murphy says, YouTube denies first link. Okay. I'm sorry if it did. It may be that the link, it might be in quote unquote my spam files, and so I can moderate it and approve it later on.
You have a chat from Craig Nelson in your chat.
I do?
The one that's
okay, in the chat on the Zoom.
Right, Zoom chat.
Okay, let me see if okay, so Craig says, to all panelists, since alchemy is an oral tradition and speaks to the soul, that is, to the blood, the images that create the symbols are fluid and remain images. Christianity speaks not to the blood, but to whiteness and the spirit. so its images become fixed metaphysical truths that exist outside us. Okay, and I'm sorry, I don't quite understand that. Do either of you get that?
I'm still reading.
I mean, okay, I have never known alchemy to be an oral tradition per se. I mean, I understand it probably was during the time that it was being practiced, the 1700 years it was being practiced, but my experiences with it, and certainly Dr. Jung's experiences with it, have all been in writing. But
I'm not familiar with the oral tradition.
I mean, I think there were adepts, and there were people who came as apprentices, and they were taught in an oral tradition in alchemy, but I'm not quite sure the point that you're trying to make, Craig. I'm sorry to say. And I guess one thing that Craig's talking about here is that we all think in images, okay? And so by image, we don't mean necessarily a visual image. It could be, for example, the image of a symphony. So that, if I think of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, then I can imagine the music playing in my head. And Craig says he can't get on video for some reason. I don't know why.
Well, I'll just toss in another thought, when it comes to symbols. It seems that in a sense, a nuclear reactor is very much a symbol.
Surely.
You just when you go by them, we don't have any where I live, but I have been to places where I've seen them, and they're just really ominous looking things, and as I said, in the reactor core itself, in the room each of us is in, imagine 4 million horses crammed into the room.
Right.
There's a symbol. We don't need to really go into much oral discussion about what that means, how it affects us psychologically, just to see these very ominous looking structures that it took a lot of engineering ego to construct these things, and it takes a lot of engineering ego to keep them properly hemmed in. And in fact, when they take the rods out of the reactor, they have to be put into a pool for 6 years to cool down. And there's a very weird glow of blue, and I forget, there's some gamma rays or something that makes the water kind of glow bluish. So all these things are like symbols that we best really think about psychologically, because we're tampering with God symbolically there.
Right. Okay. So, but in terms of this imagery now, we all think in images, and as I said, the image could be a symphony, so it might not be a visual image. It might be an image of a choreography, for example, of a dance or something like that. But if you really think about your life and think about where the way your mind goes, it goes in images. You're thinking about something and you're imagining it in your mind. In the case of the nuclear power guys, they had to imagine the nuclear reactor, and lots of imagination and fantasy had to go into it, going back to Einstein, before they could ever put their logos, their engineering hat on, and actually construct one of these things, right? And so, okay, we have nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers these days in the U.S. Navy, but they didn't build themselves. They were all the result of imagination and the eros side of the psyche. And so, I admit that when I first saw that O'Kane was putting chaos up against order, or logos, the sacred against the profane being the same dichotomy, I was surprised, okay, because I didn't think of that. But if you think of Notre Dame is a symbol and an image representing something. It isn't that thing, okay? And that's part of the point I was trying to make about my own reactions to it, which was the thing that it symbolizes wasn't damaged by the fire, okay? And for my lights, I'm happy that artisans are going to get work for the next 15 to 100 years while they rebuild Notre Dame. And so there are good aspects to it too. But Notre Dame is only an image and a symbol of something else that's sacred. And the thing that I was noticing that same week was when the three churches, I guess it was Easter Sunday, wasn't it? When the three churches were attacked in Sri Lanka. And the irony of that was totally amazing, because what the terrorists managed to do was to make all 300 people that they killed basically immortal. And they were people who weren't well known around the world, and their lives may have gone unnoticed by the rest of us, but now everybody in the world knows something about that incident now, or everybody that has a television set, let's say. And the profane logos of what the terrorists did is just ridiculous, okay? And most people would react to it that way. So they created just the opposite of their objective, from my point of view. But I wanted to go back and just close the loop on the Gethsemane idea. And my point is that, we come up against these narratives in the Christian tradition in our lives in the 21st century. And so my point about how to turn religion around is to get to this fifth stage of consciousness, which is, so let's go through the stages of consciousness just briefly. Okay, so this stage one is when you're an infant and you're in participation mystique. You're just part of, you could as easily be part of a herd of bison or a congress of monkeys or whatever it is, and you wouldn't know anything different until you gradually start to get trained as a human being. So as an infant, you're like a little king or queen. You're the same as the self, and you don't know any limits. And then when you start to get trained, and probably toilet training is the first thing that happens to people, aside from learning how to eat, you start to see your parents as gods and goddesses. This God is going to feed me today, and so on. And so that's the second stage of consciousness. Then the third stage of consciousness sort of comes at the time when, I guess, maybe you're a teenager or something, and you can project the gods out into the universe, and they're represented by the church, and your parents are no longer gods and goddesses. Lots of teenagers have knocked their parents off the pedestal once they start to grow up and reach puberty. So that's where Christianity was being taught by the Logos method. In other words, here's the formula. And even Bishop Barron actually uses that term in his conversation with Jordan Peterson, where he says, we haven't taught the catechism well enough. We have a formula for this. And all you have to do is get in the boat and start following the formula, and everything will be fine. Well, that works for a lot of people, and that's why we have so many quote unquote believers in Christianity. But a lot of believers were lost at the time that Nietzsche was realizing that God taught that way is dead. And so then people lost their moral convictions that were contained by the religion. And that was the fourth stage of consciousness, that God was dead because these myths aren't true. But the fifth stage is what's important now, is that these narratives actually are true, and they're true for all of us, and they have been true for all time, and they will always be true. And so they simply need to be taught in a somewhat different way. It's not that they're wrong, they're just, they haven't been connected up with modern sensibility. And so the reason I'm planning to give this talk on the living God and finding the living God is because I've actually had experiences which have connected me up with the biblical stories. And so now I see how it all works, and I see how salvation comes. It comes through individuation. And so anyway, I've been running a monologue here, so gents, step up. No comment, Jerome?
Well, I'll just say that Jung provides people like me with the encouragement to carry on with questioning things, to say, hey, I see an anomaly and it should be investigated. Mm-hmm. And when I've done that in the past and I've suffered for it, he validates what I did, and he validates, in a sense, the suffering, because we will have to be crucified as we go through this individuation, and we go through the story of Job, the 4 phases of challenge, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth, and fight another day, sort of thing. So that's where he gives us great hope to take on the Christianity that has come to what it is today, because both you and I have had personal experiences, and we say, hey, I'm very much interested in sharing what I know about Jesus Christ, but I'm going to maybe ruffle some feathers as I do it, because, you know, as I progress beyond the third stage, and I look at the synchronicities that have occurred, and it's all telling a story, and I'm willing to share that story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we're talking, just one other thing I'll throw in here, because you have that image of the serpents in the vase.
Oh, yes.
That's one of those, and you know, I'm actually just pulling up a YouTube video on the Mark I nuclear reactor, and it has a very similar shape, the reactor vase, and to think that there's these dragons in there.
I think I can actually share that picture. I hope so. Let's just see.
You could almost say that's prophetic, and that it was, you know, showing what we'll be inventing in the way of pressure nuclear reactor. Mark I, GE, General Electric, brings good things to life. Yeah, well, sometimes too much life.
I am going to share the image for our other viewers who haven't seen it. This is an image from 1582, and it's called Splendor Solus, is the book that it's from. And actually, let's see, somewhere here I have a new version of Splendor Solus, but I guess I don't have it on my, oh yes I do.
Yeah, just look up Mark I, General Electric Mark I nuclear reactor. It's almost like that's what you're looking at right there.
But here in 1582, the alchemist had envisioned that natural forces, namely the dragons, the three colored dragons, the white, the red, and the black one here, we were able to bottle them up by civilization, and so we still have them, but we have to keep them alive because they're our very essence. And let's see.
And when we think about it, the reactor, the nuclear reactor, is actually in us, in
sure,
mankind. No, it's not in me. I'm not a nuclear engineer, but it did come from civilization. It's like Notre Dame. You were talking about how even if it burns to the ground, it's still in us.
Right.
And we created that. So we have this, we're these massive, powerful reactors in a sense, because we are literally, because we invent these crazy things.
Precisely. And so here's the book, Splendor Solus is what it's called, the world's most famous alchemical manuscript. And here's the same image in color, which is very nice, but also we have all the images, all the alchemical images that are in Splendor Solus, which are the best ones that we think came down to us. And so here you have a pheasant in the bottle and a crown on the bottle too. So all these things have symbolic meaning, of course. And so I'm not sure I agree with the conclusions of the people that put this version of Splendor Solus together, but it's pretty inexpensive. It's $35 for a book that's over 400 years old, so you might want to get it. And Jerome, you have it too, I see. Is that Splendor Solus also? Not hearing you, sorry. You're on mute.
Yeah, this is an edition that was put out by Joseph Henderson and Diane Sherwood. If you remember Joseph Henderson, the
right
Jungian psychologist. It's called Transformation of the Psyche. I don't know if you see that, but it's got the same pictures in it.
I see. I would probably appreciate that one more than this one.
Well, yeah, Diane Sherwood and Joseph Henderson used to use these in his talks.
Uh-huh.
Now, of course, Joseph Henderson was a first generation Jungian, and he died at 100 years old about, I don't know, 12 years ago or something like that.
Right. And he's one of the authors in Man and His Symbols.
Right, yeah.
One of the four authors of Man and His Symbols.
And this was written for a layman's perspective. They were thinking about that.
Transformation of the Psyche.
Yeah, this is very, it's got the color photos as you can, I don't know if you can, here's the, if you can see the, in the alembic tube, you got the three dragons.
Oh, yeah, there it is. That's the same image.
You got the red, white, and yeah, it's got, it's very interesting. I've really treasured, this is one of my treasured books.
Do you have any sense of how much it costs?
I think it's available. I think it's $27. Maybe.
Oh, that's not too bad.
Okay. No, it's still available, and the colored pictures are great. And I also wore my dragon hat. I don't know if you can see.
Oh, is that what that is? I wanted to ask. So that's your dragon hat. Okay. I see.
Yeah, this was for, yeah, my favorite thing is dragons. So I like dragons. And I noticed you had your dragon cup.
Yes.
You were drinking out of your mug. And I said,
the other day,
I'll just wear my dragon hat.
Right.
And then we end up talking about dragons.
Right. And last night, Deb and I watched Tolkien, which is a terrific movie. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen that one. I don't get that. It's not on Netflix. It's all I get. So.
Okay. It's on demand from Prime. I'm not sure.
I think Prime and YouTube and none of the ones that I got. So,
yeah, that's too bad.
Is it a good movie?
Oh, it's a very good movie, and it interestingly, Tolkien was in the trenches during World War I, and that's where a lot of his imagery comes from, is from being in the trenches. And so they show one scene where all of a sudden this dragon rears up and shoots fire down into where Tolkien is. And then you see that it's somebody with a flamethrower. Okay, so at first it looks like a dragon, and that's where that image came from.
Oh, that is great. Wow.
Yeah, so they sort of wove together his actual experiences and the experiences of, meeting little people and going to Middle Earth and seeing Mordor for the first time and all those things. So I highly recommend it. It's very, very well done. In a way, it's quirkily done because it doesn't have this end-to-end narrative that people are used to. It's more of a pleroma presentation where, at one point he's 16 years old and he's having trouble with money, and then the next point he's a professor in Cambridge, and then he's in the trenches, and these things just bounce together. But they did it extremely well. It just holds together beautifully. And of course, Tolkien was mentioned very broadly in the Library of Congress discussion of the Red Book because Becca Tarnas had done research on Tolkien and a comparison between Tolkien and Jung. And it's not clear that Jung was very aware of Tolkien's work because I think The Hobbit didn't come out until 1937. And by then, Europe was in the midst of a war. So maybe Jung saw the book, but he was already in his 60s when he did see it. And Tolkien, of course, was, I guess, a generation and a half younger than Jung. But there's one of the points that Becca Tarnas talks about is the fact that Tolkien had a red book also. And have you gotten your red book yet?
No, I haven't heard anything yet. So
okay.
Hopefully I'll do that.
Yeah. Okay. So out there in YouTube land, we're wondering if you have any questions or comments you want to raise. I guess my bottom line point that I want to make here from a religious point of view is that what I'd like to see happen is for religious faiths to turn toward explaining the narratives in connection with things that are happening to people today. Okay, in other words, making the connection between the human being in the pew and the event. Now, the way it's always been presented to me every time I've gone to church for the last 60 years, and the reason I normally sleep in sermons is they're talking about somebody who lived 2,500 years ago, and they never bother to tell me how it relates to my life. And I think that's where Christianity, as it's presented, has lost its meaning. And that's where, that's what Bishop Barron, I mean, to me, it's just shocking to find Bishop Barron talking about the fact that he's in charge of a committee of Roman Catholic bishops who are supposed to be bringing people into the church, and he's losing 6 for every one he brings in. And I say, oh my God, you know, that's amazing. Obviously, you're doing something wrong. You got to change what you're doing. And but he just wants to go back and say, well, you got to start in the catechism and then you'll get it. Well, you know, once you get, I agree that once you get into the religious setup, and it happens in Buddhism too, where once you're in the religion and you go through the training, yeah, you start to get it. And yes, you might ultimately have a religious experience that really connects you. But the problem is that a lot of people just won't even get into the flow of that. And so the people who have what Dr. Jung called the charisma of belief, they're blessed because they're in that flow of the catechism or the dogma or whatever it is, and they're covered. But the rest of us who say, well, yeah, that's nice, but how does it help me? A lot of people don't get it. And
well, it is a practice that you partake, and we can take lots of practices to get there. But sure. I think the stage of consciousness 4, you said we lost the moral consciousness, and that's what we're seeing in this spread out crazy world of
and so we have to find. So the key is to find that moral consciousness again.
Right, and so our quest is, how can we find our moral consciousness? And we need to listen to the stories of what happens to the psyche. That's actually what Jung discovered, the way the psyche works. Mm-hmm. And he discovered that these stories are archetypes.
Sure.
And they were activated for a certain purpose. And if the fasters could explain that purpose instead of, as you said, sometimes I sleep even watching a Paul VanderKlay sermon. I did the other day. I mean, it's just his sermons. It's not his.
I do have a habit of putting in my earbuds and lying down and getting a bit of a sleep when I'm listening to some of these videos. But here's my observation. Let me ask you what you think. I think that most of the things that we remember, most of the things that we remember from our youth are actually numinous experiences, but they get so blown away by, so much, I was hearing Gene Houston, and there's a terrific speech by Dr. Gene Houston on the Pacifica Graduate Institute website. I urge you to listen to it. But we're having these numinous experiences, but because we're facing between 5 and 100 times as much information as were experienced by our ancestors, even our parents. I mean, we didn't have that much information when in the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, in the early 60s, I was in Japan and didn't even talk to my grandparents for 3 years because it was too hard. And Brandy says the Christ consciousness, and yes, you're correct, Brandy. And so the issue is, welcome back, Jerome. So what I was saying was that as I reflect on the things that I particularly remember from earlier stages of my life, those are mostly numinous experiences. But I didn't understand them as such, and I didn't even think about them in a religious context a lot. But as I think back on them, understanding noumena and numinosity, I realize that most of those things that come to mind easily, if somebody says, well, think of something that happened when you were 10 years old, the things that I will remember are things that were numinous. They were kind of religious experiences at that time. Miles, are you still with us? We lost
Yes, I am.
Okay. Do you have a thought about this?
Well, I do, because, I sometimes think I'm just a regular guy. I'm not a type A personality.
Mm-hmm.
I have fear. I'm lethargic. But it seems that, we are given so much at this information at this point in time, including Carl Jung,
Mm-hmm.
which you're bringing to the table for me. And I'm thinking, okay, I've had these issues, I'll also say anomalies that don't make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to, as Albert Einstein said, mankind needs to change her thinking if we're to survive. Carl Jung said the world hangs by a thin thread that is the psyche of man. And so I'm just thinking, okay, I have all this information coming at me. And in fact, driving today, I was on a road trip, and I was thinking about how not too many years ago, life, like just a couple of decades ago, life was pretty kind of, lackadaisical or very, very enjoyable, because we didn't have all this information, and we're presented with it, and it's like an obligation to figure out what it is that we're supposed to do with it, like
Right.
Individually and collectively.
Yeah.
What are we supposed to do with it? And so, for example, just very recently with this conversation around Paul VanderKlay and versus Carl Jung, and the fact that it doesn't matter whether you're in an engineering firm or in a theological seminary and denomination, you're supposed to stick to the corporate line. And those people, even in a corporation, such as, say, a nuclear power plant, those people who say, hold it, we got some safety issues over here. There's some anomalies that we need to attend to. Wow, you can find yourself being really hammered on because you're rocking the boat. You're not a team player. And it's the same, I think, in these religious denominations, right? So one of the things I encountered was the Athanasian Creed. And I've read the Athanasian Creed. It was, from my recollection, generated by some pope. It's not of the Bible, but it was one of these councils that they had. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, that Athanasian Creed to me is what the Bible waivers will use to clobber someone to say, well, you're going to hell because you haven't been baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. And so I'm just saying, well, sorry, folks, I think maybe those of you that are following the Athanasian Creed might be going to hell if you want to get into a debate about this. So one of us is going to hell, but I don't believe in the Athanasian Creed. So anyway, so this information is available for us, and it's available for us to debate. And, at some point in time, I guess we'll figure out what is the actual truth. But so that's my rant.
Yeah, from my view, if you actually have an experience of the numinous, then it's pretty easy to sort the wheat from the chaff, in my view. And as I think back on these early experiences, I definitely see what's significant to me and what isn't. Jerome, are you with us again? It looks like you are, but I'm not sure he can hear us.
Yeah, strange. Craig says he's available to chat, but he can't seem to appear. I don't know. How's that happening to Jerome?
Okay. All
right.
So
I'm here. I just my internet just went off twice.
Yeah.
And I've had the problem all day long. So
okay.
I can't guarantee that I won't pop off and back up.
Right. So the issue is that in the 15th century, the average person got in a lifetime the same amount of information that we now have available to us in the Sunday New York Times, one issue. And so obviously we're being overwhelmed with information way more than even our parents were. And the question is how to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so as I think about it, I think the things that I remember are the numinous things, are the things that one would count as religious. Do you have a thought about that?
Well, I agree that, we've just logarithmically expanded our knowledge base.
Right.
And were we actually designed to cope with that? We might ask ourselves, and maybe that's part of it. We get too much information.
Yeah, obviously we weren't designed to cope with it.
Right. We don't sort it. And, in the olden days, you had a lot of people couldn't read, or they actually read the Bible. And they also, were hard workers and everything, and got ahead and all that. I mean, that was really what they were about, and
sure.
In that particular
they were about survival. People were surviving. So all of our ancestors, and we all go back millions of generations, obviously. And
yeah, maybe it's just too fast for us, and we lose that. It used to be a sense of family, community. Everybody lived together. Everybody knew each other else. Everybody else. I mean, it still happens in certain places today, connections, but we've separated from the roots or family, and we're kind of scattered around. I'm not sure about what you mean by the numinous.
Well, I'll give you.
We all have numinous experiences, I would think.
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples, and they're, some of them are unusual. Okay, one of the first ones that I remember was when I was 5 years old, going on 6. My mother, who was then 25 years old and quite beautiful, was tasked with driving me and my brother and sister, who were younger than me, including my sister, who was 9 months old, across the United States from Philadelphia to Seattle. In order, we couldn't get shipping to my father's duty station in Kodiak unless we appeared physically in Seattle. And my father had to go ahead to his duty, so he was already in Kodiak. And so my mother engaged in this trip in 1952, and in August of 1962, across the country. And I remember being in the Badlands with her one time, and one of the tasks that I had was to dry the diapers of my sister, because my mother would hand wash them in these motels we would stay in, and then I had to hold them out the window and dry them. And so at one point, I just, a dark side idea came into my head, and I let the darn thing go, right? And of course, it went out the back, and I think we didn't stop. I can't remember whether we stopped or not. I have two forms of memory on that one. I have a memory that we stopped, and I have a memory that we didn't stop. We did one of the two, but my mother was quite jovial after that event, and I just remember looking up at her at one point in that exchange and just thinking, wow, I'm in the car with a goddess. And so I remember that transition of my own from the participation mystique into stage 2, where I'm with my mother, who's a goddess. But another one, which was particularly noteworthy, was we used to like to go to movies, and in Kodiak, we saw a black and white film, which was like a very early version of Jurassic Park. It was sort of the quality of the early King Kong movie, the first King Kong movie. And in that movie, there was a creature that looked like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but there's another kind of dinosaur that has a very long head, or neck and head, that is up 40 feet off the ground and can eat from the top of the trees. And
I think that's a Brontosaurus. Brontosaurus.
Okay, so at that time, we didn't have a lot of toys of dinosaurs and that sort of thing. And so I saw the movie, which was black and white, of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. But that night, I had a dream of the Brontosaurus. Okay. And I had dreamed that I was looking out my window and I could see this creature up above me, and it was eating from the top of the trees. Well, that memory has to be, it has to go back 200 or 300 million years, maybe longer, because, that image was programmed into me. It wasn't something that I had picked up from the environment, because in those days we just didn't have the kind of access to images that we have today. And so that was quite a numinous thing. And the fact that I remember it makes it numinous. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jerome or Miles? I think we might have lost Jerome. And did you hear my story?
I heard this. Excuse me.
Somebody's grabbed our screen. That might be Craig? Craig has sent us a lot of things. This is Miles is sending us this.
Oh, here. I didn't know you could see my screen, but I'm looking for.
You're sharing your screen, so we.
Oh, I am, eh? Okay.
Yeah.
There's a Brontosaurus model, a big one, at the Calgary Zoo, and I just thought, well, I could try to bring it up, but let's see if I go here. Dino the Dino.
Dino the Dino.
Fun.
Okay.
Well, I saw the bear, so I'm very familiar with the bear. I had a bear the other day, so.
Yeah, that was numinous. And then when we were in the Shenandoah last week, we saw an adolescent black bear up there, and that was quite numinous too.
Oh yeah, they're beautiful animals.
Yeah, he was just running through the woods, but I mean, when I think about it, it makes me kind of emotional. It's kind of the sacred out there kind of thing. So you weren't able to find it, Miles, I gather.
Sorry, no, I couldn't find it.
Okay.
It's a it was actually constructed in the 50s, so.
I see.
It's of your vintage, would have been maybe something you'd even have seen in a photo, because it's a very massive, I think it's a life-size Brontosaurus at the Calgary Zoo.
Well, I'm sure I didn't see it before 1952, though.
Did you ever drive through Canada to get up to Kodiak? Or did you go by ship?
We went by ship from Seattle to Kodiak direct and flew back. We flew back in an old DC-3.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so, no, I haven't. I've been up through British Columbia up to Nakusp, where my friend used to live.
Interesting. Nakusp. He was in Nakusp because I lived in Nelson, British Columbia, which is close to Nakusp, and indeed that was a favorite border crossing down by Nelson, British Columbia for the draft dodgers. There's quite a few people who would still say, yeah, I'm now Canadian, but I live in that area, because it's a particularly beautiful part of the country with
it's fantastic
lakes and such. So yeah. the draft dodgers knew where the best place to go was.
I very much enjoyed our trip up there, and I still have on my bathroom wall a painting by his wife of the Columbia River gorge there, next to which they lived. They actually lived up on a logging road, 32 miles from Nakusp, and so it was one of these logging roads where you had to have a radio, two-way radio, and there's a mile mark every kilometer, and you had to announce whether you were up mountain or down mountain and what kilometer mark you were at, because these logging trucks would come off the mountain and they would have 3 logs on the truck, and they would be dragging 3. so they couldn't stop. Well, once they launched, and they had this little ski jump type thing up at the top of the mountain, so they could launch and have some momentum going down. And so if you were in the way of one of these logging trucks, good luck, because so you had to listen to the calls from the logging trucks, which would say where they were, and then pull into these pullouts to get out of the way of them if they were coming down. The problem was that late in the afternoon they would lie. Okay, the truckers would lie because there was a ferry just south of Nakusp, about 20 miles south of Nakusp, and the ferry closed at 6 p.m. And so be closed at 6 p.m. and these truckers would say, "Oh, well, wait for me. I'm at kilometer 2 or something like that." And they were actually at kilometer 15 or something, but they didn't want the ferrymen to leave them.
Yeah, that would be the Fauquier Needles ferry. Mm-hmm. On Arrow Lake, and south of Nakusp is also Slocan Lake and Slocan Valley, right down to Nelson, BC. And that it's not so much anymore, but in the 70s, because of the American draft dodgers that were in there, it was renowned for its hippie culture, because mm-hmm. A lot of the draft dodgers were into the hippie culture back then too, I believe.
Yeah, I'm going to try to get our screen back the right way because I can't see any comments. So nobody is commenting on YouTube at the moment. So
well, I'll share one. It's
okay. Go ahead.
Do you remember the 1964 World's Fair in New York?
Yes, I do. Sure.
Did you, by chance, get to see Michelangelo's The Pieta?
Well, I have seen it, but I didn't see it there.
Yeah, well, I was about 15, I think, and talk about a numinous experience. That statue was alive, and I never felt anything like that before, and I was just dumbfounded. I didn't really know what it meant, because I'm not religious, but it was just absolutely stunning, and the essence was there.
And so that definitely is one of these numinous things that you remember.
Yeah. Right.
And was that the original, which is now in not the Vatican, St. Paul's in Rome?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Same
wow, way. They transported it.
Yeah, there's a whole big story about that and the way it was created.
Wow. Well, I did see it. I did see it in St. Paul's Cathedral in 1999, and I know what you mean. You look at that thing, and it's unbelievable that out of stone, it looks so alive.
Right.
It looks so real. It's emotionally, psychologically very impactful.
Right. So I should give some due recognition of Craig's offerings, which are here on the Zoom chat. So he had given us the stuff about alchemy, but then the vessel contains us objectively behind glass, sealed up. The vessel creates distance. The dragon to be slain is the ego. But I'm not sure about that, Craig, because I'm not. I mean, in the splendor soulless image that we're looking at. This image, and I'll give it back to you for a moment so everybody can see what I'm talking about once again. In this image, this is not to be slain. These dragons are part of our psyche, but they're the energy that makes things go. And so they're bottled up to be controlled, but not to be killed, certainly. But anyway, that's my observation and comment about that.
I would say you don't slay the ego or you disappear.
Yeah, I mean,
ego is consciousness,
Yeah, we need our ego. Now, Craig gave us another link, which I got here. All right, I guess it's a place where you can download a scan of the Red Book. Okay, so I'm going to share this link on YouTube because otherwise only the people that are in Zoom can get it, but it's a place where you can get an electronic copy of the Red Book, which is useful to have if you're on a budget. Now, let me see, how do I get back to my YouTube chat? That's the question. Okay, here's the YouTube chat. And so I'll just provide this link. And if oops. Okay. Let me just take some information off here because I'm only allowed 200 characters. Okay, so there's the link on YouTube. And that's a link to where you can actually download a copy of the electronic version of the Red Book. But you probably want to have your own. I certainly have mine over my shoulder, and I treat it with more respect actually than I was treating the Holy Bible in the interview with Paul. But in that interview, I was trying to make a shocking comment as an attention getter. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of people thought I was blasphemous, but actually I'm not. But the reality is that, you know, life is not in things. Life is in the Eros side. And so anyway, did you have any more comments from people commenting on VanderKlay's side? Jerome, I didn't get a chance to look at everything.
There was a comment about that the Fuere and Fiorella archetype was constellated.
Right.
And that part of this development that we're looking at in stages of consciousness is the Fuere or Fiorella. I can't say the word.
I think it's Puer and Puella.
Okay, you say it.
Okay. Puer is an adolescent boy, and a Puella is an adolescent girl.
Right. And what's happening, and this gets back to, we don't have rituals in this country.
Right. And so
we stay there. And if you don't get out into the world and start experiencing it, you will stay in that state, and you will be just that child forever. You'll be subject to anything that comes up. Emotion, you know, you don't grow up. In other words,
right. It's like a Peter Pan type of thing where you never want to grow up and assume a mature responsibility in the world. And, you know, Jordan Peterson rightfully says, you know, you gotta take a load. And the point is that young people, when they're being educated up, however far they go, whether it's, you know, 8th grade or high school level or college, or they get a PhD, whatever it is, you know, those are all just training to be able to face life at different levels. But once you stop, then you have to face life. And so then you have to face the chaos, which is what life is. It's all chaos.
Yeah, and then when you get older, you can go back and be the little child.
Well, but then Hillman made the dichotomy of puer and senex, which he wrote a book called Puer and Senex. And of course, the three of us are all senex, which means we're old guys. I won't say what I really mean, but old guys who have been through a few crises in our lives, and
That's for sure.
we have a mature view of the world, which I should have a gray beard, but I have resisted doing it.
Well, VanderKlay's got one. Let's see, we can name the ones that, Peterson's got one.
Right.
You need to get with the program. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I know.
You have to have some fun,
Yeah, I'm resisting the idea. That's where I'm up for, I guess. Okay, so let's see. Brandy says, "Have a good night, gentlemen, and thank you, Skip, for taking your time to bring knowledge to the people." And Psyche and Stats tutor, Rebecca's thesis is awesome. I watched it twice. Which is Rebecca's thesis? Are you talking about Hierophant, or I'm not sure which thesis you're talking about. Psyche and Stats tutor, I don't know what you're talking about. But if I don't see any reference to Rebecca here, so maybe we could ask you to just connect up your statement with what it is you're referring to. If it's the Hierophant thing, we will look at that. Okay. All right, so here we are. Any other thoughts before we wrap up for the night?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment about the rituals that we do or don't have. Curiously, I picked up this newspaper. It's called the National Post here in Canada. Mm-hmm. And Jordan Peterson is on the front page.
Oh, wow.
And the only thing about this article really isn't so much about what Jordan Peterson thinks, but it's called The Age of Deep Fakes.
Uh-huh.
And the issue that he's bringing forward is that apparently the technology now is such that people have come up with computer programs or apps that can take anyone's image and their voice and completely fake them visually and vocally. And so his voice has been captured, his image has been captured too, I believe. And they have him saying whatever they want him to say. It's really quite scary. So he brings that to the fore. But what was interesting is that I found this article by an editorial by a gentleman named Conrad Black. I don't know if you know the name Conrad Black, but he's he's a Canadian entrepreneur. He's been rather a controversial figure. But what struck me is that he says, he's talking about capitalism, and he says capitalism will always win eventually as the only economic system aligned with the universal human ambition for more. So that's, I thought, holy cow, it's called Peace, Love, and Energy, and he's all about, he's a multi-millionaire, and he's a publisher, and he's a controversial kind of a figure. And anyway, it just struck me, it's like the boat outside in the marina there. What does it say on the back of it?
It says never enough.
Never enough. And it's like, this is what he says too. Capitalism is the only economic system aligned with the universal human ambition for more. Well, that might be his concept of a universal ambition. But that's what I think, that's why we're in such a state. Because in fact, that is the ritual that we're all been brought up to believe, that, we just acquire and more. And it's just, it's not working anymore. It's going to kill us.
Oh, wait a minute here. I'm trying to give it to you here, but
And then they can imitate Jordan Peterson, and so Walt Disney wins in the end because animation is what's at least for my granddaughter, she was just enamored by Walt Disney, and she wants to be a princess. So,
well, and she's right about that. The problem is that she won't be. Okay, so here's never enough. So the point is, here's this boat. It's a 63-foot motor yacht, and
maybe it's owned by Conrad Black.
I have
he's
no
rich
idea.
enough to have a boat like that, but
right.
He's got these. He's saying that's his purpose in life, his
right.
ambition for more.
Right, and so here's this boat, but nobody's in it. It's tied up at the dock, and so it was his ambition, obviously, to get to the point where he could buy a boat like that, which must be upwards of $1 million or more, and then he's not using it. So it's obviously not filling the spiritual need that was there, and it's not enough. So he wants a bigger boat. And I had the same experience when I had just a 27-foot boat, and we took it out on the Chesapeake Bay, and Chesapeake Bay is big water. And so my partner on the boat and I immediately said, we need a bigger boat. But the problem is, if you just keep doing that over and over again, it's satisfying from a spiritual point of view to try to get it. But once you get it, it's not doing anything for you spiritually anymore. And this is the problem with all materialism, which is it doesn't fulfill your needs. And we can just look at our president, who is the poster boy of materialism, because he's managed to get himself everything he might ever want. He's got the trophy wife and the tower in Manhattan, and the golf courses around the world that he owns, and he's got the most important job in the world. And is this man happy? That's the issue. And
it brings us to John Vervaeke and his ongoing series of the meaning crisis.
Yeah,
because if that's the meaning for people, the guy that owns that boat, when he's on his deathbed, is he going to be thinking about, I'm going to miss my boat, my $1 million boat? How am I going to take that with me into the next world?
Right. It's not going to work real well. But all of us will be in the next world, because we're here on video, which will be deathless.
Yeah.
Even YouTube is now hiding from providers like me the number of videos that I have, and I think we're about to pass 1,000 in one or two more. In fact, this might be 1,000. I'm not sure, but if it isn't, one of the ones I'll do in the next week will be.
Yeah, well, let's make a party of it. Everybody will get yourself a cake and bring it to the party, and we'll have cake and coffee.
Right. So everybody can go back and try to search through this, whatever it is, 1,500 or 2,000 hours worth of video that I've created in the last 3 years. And it will be, our spirits will be living on after us, immortal. Because I don't think YouTube ever takes anything down unless you intentionally do it. And because anything that draws people to view, they want. So where did you get the dragon hat?
I don't remember. I picked it up somewhere. Why do you want one? I can probably look at the back and.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I like the color, and I like that it matches your shirt.
Okay, I tried to do that too. It's almost purple down here, but
Right. It actually looks purple, so it's good.
But I would like to say, I think your talk with VanderKlay was quite helpful, and I think he's moving in that direction. Particularly, he is talking with Veracki about the participation, which is it's a movement towards what Owen Barfield's participation is. So he's moving in that direction, but very slowly,
So what was Owen Barfield? Because I haven't had time to go back and look, and I can't chase all these philosophers.
Yeah, Owen Barfield with C.S. Lewis is Paul VanderKlay's favorite author of religious authors. And Owen Barfield was, there were 4 guys, and they were called the Inklings. And they met in England, and they talked and back and forth. And, it was quite a gentleman's argument back and forth, but there was some big differences between the two. And one of them was about what we're talking about. Owen Barfield is more closely aligned with Jungian thought.
I see.
Whereas C.S. Lewis is sometimes on the opposite end of the spectrum. So it should be interesting to see how the discussions go.
Well, I heard somebody refer to C.S. Lewis as a Christian apologist.
Yes, he was.
Okay, which means he's on the rational end of the spectrum.
Right, yeah. He didn't believe in imagination at all. So, anyway, Owen Barfield was about imaginal, not necessarily imagination. So there's a difference there. But he felt that by reviewing and coming back and tracing the history and dealing with these is how you get back to the original intent of the stories. And that's what Owen Barfield was about. He was about enlivening these stories back to their original numinosity.
Yeah, which is exactly what I'm saying. I mean, that's what was at the beginning of that interview, where I was showing some of my religious experiences and saying, for me, I don't have a need to believe I know, in the same sense that Dr. Jung meant it. I've had the experience and I know. And so it doesn't matter what any preacher of any flavor says to me.
You can't be talked out of that experience. I know
that's right.
Yeah. One of the things, I very much appreciate Paul VanderKlay for is because he's read so much, and, he'll be quite humble and say he needs to read a lot more, but he certainly is well read. And when he was talking about Owen Barfield, there was one thing that he said that just struck me, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. And that is that Owen Barfield said, "Poets will save the world."
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, it is so true. And now that makes me think of, I'm particularly enamored with 80s love songs. And these songs, whether they're by rock and roll artists or whoever, they're poetry.
Yeah,
and they have psychological effects because, like, for example, U2 of Ireland or Bon Jovi of New Jersey, they've sold hundreds of millions of records.
And so that's because those are numinous experiences. Absolutely.
They have, numinous and psychological effect on those people. The messages are very deep if you take the time to listen. And also with the music, the guitar, the drums. In fact, Tico Torres is the drummer for Bon Jovi. And, he's probably pushing 70 or more years old. And John Bon Jovi said, "Hey, Tico Torres, the gods of lightning and thunder report to you." And it's true. You see that man pounding on the drums.
Right.
There's something numinous about it.
Right.
Yeah, the tribal.
And so, yeah, maybe poets will save the world.
Well, poets and musicians and a few people talking it over like us. Richard Elliott, who's had some exchanges with me in the last few days, said, "I just woke up. Sorry I missed the party. We need a bigger boat," from Jaws, he says, and I agree with that. Yep. Well, if you're fishing for a white shark, you might need a bigger boat, but otherwise, you might want to find something that feeds your soul rather than your materialistic, sort of a tick-off list. Okay, so I've got a boat, now I need a bigger boat. And what does that get you? It doesn't get you anything. The best times I've had on a boat were 30 years ago with Debbie out on the Chesapeake Bay, when we only rented. We could rent large sailboats because I'm quite a good seaman, and so we've rented up to 37 footers, just the two of us, and we had lots of fun doing it. And those were definitely numinous experiences. One time we were on the other side of the bay when a really bad storm came up, and we had to get the boat back because we had rented it and it was due back by 5 p.m. And we had to sail across the shipping channel in the middle of Chesapeake Bay, and with 8-foot waves, which was big enough for us at the time, especially since there were only the two of us. And but we did it, and we came into the river to deliver the boat back right at 5 p.m. And the guy we rented the boat from was coming out the river. I think he was coming out to look for us. And we were coming in. And, so anyway, he was happy.
The question is, was he worried about the boat or you?
Well,
hopefully both.
Well, both. And we had ripped a couple of the grommets out of the mainsail, and because those winds were quite high, there were 40, 50 knot gusts out there, and that's enough. and so he was going out, and he pretended he wasn't looking at us as he went out the river. He pretended he was on his way to something else. But then by the time we got docked, he was right there with us again. And I said, "Well, we lost a couple of grommets." And he says, "Well, okay, that happens." And he just left it. That was the end of it. But those were the best times. And it wouldn't have been better if we'd had 100-footer. Right. So that's the point. That was an experience, and anyway.
Experiences over the material. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's what life is about.
Right.
Experience.
Right. That's where you get the sacred experience, the spiritual experience. Okay, so peace. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We still have 8 people online besides the 3 of us, so that's a good show, because this morning the number was running around 7 or 8 consecutive or simultaneous viewers, and at the end of it there were more than 100 people had watched, so it might be that kind of number again tonight. So good night. And
good night. Always
nice
a pleasure.
To see you. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Skip.
Thank you all for being here. I will run a session next week, even though it's Labor Day. It's not really a day off for me. So do you want to be here next week, Jerome?
Sure. That's fine.
Okay. Well, good. All right.
Yeah, I'll probably be around too. So
okay.
Look forward to it.
All right. We'll see you all soon then. Take care.